evening. Nice to have a small group. I'm Betsy Kelly. I'm on the Board of Trustees of the library, and I absolutely love this library, and I really welcome you. One of the things I wanted to let everyone know is that we have such robust programming here, and only 15% of our annual budget comes from municipal funds. All the rest of our budget for this library is donations from families in the neighborhood. So it's a really special place. We are able, I'm going to go to my script now, though we are able to offer free programs like this year-round, thanks to the generosity of our donors and thanks to our community of artists, educators, and collaborators. Coming up next Monday, we're hosting the Bar Harbor Music Festival for an informational presentation on their summer opera. On Tuesday, we're partnering with Friends of Acadia on a book launch for Steve Kemp's An Exaltation of Parks. And on Wednesday next week, the MDI Historical Society is offering a history lecture titled Wabanaki Foodways and Environmental Stewardship. To hear more about any of those, you can sign up for our Sunday newsletter at this table right by the entrance. So Edward F. Moreau received his master's in applied ethics from Oxford in 2023, following his accomplished career as a physician and retina specialist. His graduate dissertation was titled NeuroEthics of Electronic Screen Over-Stimulation in Infancy. Please welcome Dr. Edward F. Moreau.
Thank you, Betsy Kelly. And let me first start out by saying this is our first visit to this library, and what a treat, what a fantastic building and everything. And I want to also say thank you to Zach and for helping arrange this, and as well as to Betsy and the rest of the staff. Northeast Harbor has a special place for us. We used to come here regularly for the Northeast Harbor Road Race. We just loved it all the time. And so we miss coming here. Maybe someday they'll bring that back again. And coming here, also, we've been now in Maine, well, over 30 years, but now coming into full-time. Does anyone here live full-time, by the way? Okay, there you go. And we're getting, we got to get back used to how winter is described, where it's, oh my gosh, winter is coming. Oh no, winter is here, winter's still here. And then the fourth season is Ellsworth Road construction time. That's the fourth yes, which we didn't experience on the way in. How I'm going to do this, what I'd like to do is I don't want to be anchored to the PowerPoint. So while I'm talking, please feel free to either disagree or ask questions. Don't hesitate, because it makes it more, and if you, controversy lightens things up. If you disagree with something, want to add something, that would be great. One of the things I should say, I am not a neuropsychologist or neurobiologist, and I got interested in this actually in the late 90s when there were a certain degree of techno-optimism, and we had young daughters, and there was some questioning about what that meant. I want to make some things, first I'm going to start, this may be a little unusual, what this talk is not about. This talk is not anti-technology. That's almost as though saying to be against electricity or fire. We're not talking about no electricity, nor is it about the recent talk that you all have heard about, particularly through Jonathan Haidt, about the ills of social media and youth and teenagers, et cetera, mood disorders. What I'm addressing here is a specific time period, and I'm going to give you reasons why that is, of critical brain development and why I'm focusing on that. Let's see. Interesting, 2024, little aside, the Oxford word of the year was brain rot, which is kind of did anyone else hear about that? As defined by the deterioration of a person's mental or intellectual state. It's interesting why that came up so late. Does that have any bearing on what's happening during critical brain development? And I'd say there is a correlation to that. I also want to make clear that changing this part of childhood, very difficult task. I almost liken it to trying to empty Blue Hill Bay with a tablespoon, because the technology and screens are so integral to our lives right now. And generally, most parents, and I'm going to say most people in this room, probably are aware that screens are not good. When are you going to meet a parent who says, oh no, we don't care, we just let them have all they want, we don't, everyone is going to say, oh no, we limit the screens to our 2-year-old. Oh no, half hour only good programming. And I liken that as the dental floss argument, where when you go to a dentist, says, have you been flossing? Who's saying, oh no, everyone says, of course I floss. So this is a very difficult task to overcome. And there's I bring up this image right now to show why this is so important. This is a bonobo chimpanzee, another primate besides ourselves. And why do I bring this up? As primates, there is a critical role that childhood plays with our brains. There's multiple folds. Our brains are meant to have a long childhood where there's interaction, you learn language, you model from the parents. And one of the things that, and Jonathan Haidt mentions this also, and I mention it, is that screens are interrupting this long childhood that a primate like the bonobo chimps and as well as ourselves go through. When a horse is born or a wildebeest, it immediately gets up and starts running. As we're much different. This crucial time from birth to the first few years of life are very, very set, and I'm going to go into what happens in the brain during that time that's so important. If you think of screens or screen toxicity as a public health problem, we've had other public health issues in the past as well. And is there an analogy to smoking? And there is some analogy in the 1950s that smoking was downplayed, it's ubiquitous, but it was a little bit easier than this particular issue because there's less utility in smoking. We use screens and the internet constantly. We're dependent on so much, almost like electricity. How can we change this model during early childhood? So what I'm going to talk about today is, first of all, for many people, is it really a problem at all? Is there a problem with infants, and do we have any consequence, or does it really matter at all? Or is it just like Chicken Little, the sky is falling when there's no problem? The mental health experts, particularly in the youth and teenage years, are already letting out the fire alarms and the emergency rooms, and they don't have to tell you the mental health counselors on campuses say there is definitely a mental health crisis in youth. Is it related as to what happens during those early years, birth to 3 years old to 4 years old? And I submit there is a relation as to what happens later on. This talk is also going to involve what I call an ethical argument about what we owe the infant. Does the infant in this have any rights at all about what their future is going to be like, what their future brain, and I'm going to make the argument that they do. And the thing about any ethical argument is you get into this thing of relativism. Just because a parent says, well, you may think that screens are bad, I think they're okay and enhance my baby's success in the world. You like chocolate, I like vanilla, let's go home. But it's not always like that. Sometimes there really are better and worse choices, even in ethics. And the main ethical thing we're going to come across with this issue of screen during infancy is very important. Parental autonomy versus the infant's well-being. And you might have a parent who says, don't tell me what I'm going to do what I want. I don't really care what you say. I'm perfectly fine with my infant being on a screen, 2 years old all day. The thing that has changed, though, is that in the recent 5 to 10 years, there is now a lot more evidence that this screen use during critical brain development has neurological and neurotoxic effects. It is no longer just a correlation. I think we're getting on the verge, if we aren't there already, that there is a causation. It's not just, that is to say, someone say, well, the reason that the kids are on screens or having higher ADHD was during COVID, or there was economic problems, or there's arguments against that it's the screens are the problem. But we're getting much, much closer to, and I'm going to go into some studies to support that as well. Okay, so I mentioned about infants and welfare lights, and this conflict between parental autonomy and beneficence and what childcare providers can do. I'm going to get back to this theme. It's not as though the American Academy of Pediatrics has not been aware of screens toxicity on youth and infants. In fact, they issued a policy statement way back in 2016. And I'm not going to dwell on all, and this is only part of the policy statement. But as you can read, it says they're recommending discourage use of screen media. Okay, discourage, not very strong in children under 18 months. Choose high quality and watch them with your children. In children less than 2 years old, limit media to 1 hour or less. And no screens during meals in 1 hour. I have a problem with this policy statement. And I'm going to get back to this later on. I don't think this is adequate, and I disagree with it. And this is actually has been modified. I don't think in the real world, in a practical sense, the parents are doing this at all. And I think all of you have maybe experienced that anecdotally. How many people will say they are, just like the dental flossing, how many parents are actually doing this? Now, of course, there are exceptions, and there's families in Silicon Valley. I was talking to people tonight that are very, very good about limiting screens. But for the most part, I think the Academy of Pediatrics is being way, way too idealistic, that this is not the real world. The other thing I'm going to mention is there is an analogy to lead toxicity that I'm going to be talking about. And to put this out there, it's almost as though saying, well, we think that lead is toxic, but during the first few years of life, we're going to allow 10% lead in the water because we're just going to allow a little bit, but not too much. And I have a little problem with that. Since it is neuroethics, I'm not going to make you into a medical ethicist right now, but I'm just going to go over the very basics of what medical ethics is, really, really basic. And it involves 4 things that you probably have heard of: autonomy, beneficence, non-malfeasance, and justice. What I'm going to be focusing on is the parent autonomy and what's right for the child and that clash. So I mentioned, is there a problem? By the way, if anyone disagrees with any of this, please, if you say there is no problem, or my grandkids are doing great, and I had a nephew who grew up with a tablet and now runs a software company and is brilliant, please speak up. Any controversy. So anyway, this goes back, one of the first major studies was actually sort of pre-iPad, pre-iPhone, a group of Christakis' group out on the West Coast. And what he found was he was correlating the number of hours of just TV and cartoon watching to symptoms of ADHD. We're not even talking about 24-hour iPads and smartphones. This is just television watching. And what he found was there was a correlation that for every hour more of TV per day, there was a 10% increase in the chances of having ADHD. What's the other evidence? ADHD, the incidence appears to be rising. And I'm going to show a slide with that. From an inflection point, does anyone know what's special about the year 2007? I'm going to show you the graph of that in a moment. What happened in 2007 of ADHD? I'm going to get into that.
It was the shots.
Vaccinations?
The DVTs.
That's a thought, but that's not what I'm getting. That's not what I'm getting to. I will be getting to that. That's a good thought. The reversing Flynn effect. Briefly, Flynn was a neurobiologist who correlated that every 10 years since the 20s and 30s, humans seem to be getting smarter on IQ testing. Now that seems to be reversing on a global scale. It's called the reversed Flynn effect. He's famous among neurobiologists and neuropsychologists. It's called the Flynn effect. And they couldn't quite figure out why were humans really getting smarter every 10 years because the IQs kept going up slowly and they had to keep readjusting the standard. And you're going to hear me talk about critical brain development. Why is that so different? And when I say critical brain development, I mean from birth to age 3. It's nothing hard and fast about 36 months. It could be 48 months or 5 years, but something is happening with the brain and development that is very special to our brains. Autonomy versus paternalism, I mentioned that. Let me go on here about the conflict. Infant screen overstimulation. That first slide I showed you about the AAP's policy, it's really that 90% of infants now are watching from 1 to 3 hours of media per day, not following against the Academy's recommendations. So here's that graph that I wanted to show you. Approximately here is, I don't know if it shows up, this inflection point, I don't know if you can see it, does it show it here, 2007? Anyway, 2007 is down here. That was when the first iPhone and iPads were released. 2007, 2008, roughly in there. And you can see, now you could argue the ADHD was a higher diagnosis, more screening, broadening the diagnosis, whatever. But it's hard to deny the rise. And in 2007, you had 4.4 million cases. In 2025, it's now estimated that approximately 11%, 12% of all children have some form of ADHD. Again, taking into account it may be overdiagnosed and more screening. How do you go about, if you say that, you can't run an experiment giving children iPads to one group, follow them for 2 years, and not giving another group of iPads. That would hardly be ethical, right? I can't think of a review committee approving such a study. How are we going to go ahead and prove that there is some toxicity during these early years? How do you convince a parent who's saying, no, this is all chicken little stuff? Well, Christakis tried to do this, and what he developed out there was a mouse TV room. Sounds kind of crazy. And what he did was he had mice and he had stimulation trying to simulate rapid imaging from TV with sounds and lights moving very, very quickly from birth as the rats were maturing. And what he found was very interesting. Rats generally in the natural state will avoid spaces, bright lights, they'll follow the sides of the wall. And most important, if you place an object in the rat's area, the rat will come and explore it and sniff it and find out what it is. But if anyone have any mice at home, they tend to follow the sides. They don't go out in the middle. The rats that they subjected to the TV room completely lost rat-like behavior. They didn't stay to the walls. They wandered aimlessly. They moved around. And the pattern on the right during the maze, the open test, you had the controls versus the rats in the TV room. Does this prove that rapid imaging causes ADHD? Well, not really, but it may show that something's going on. But also, most important, the rats that had the rapid imaging from birth seemed to have lost their curiosity when they put a strange object in the cage. They weren't sniffing it, smelling it, but they just weren't doing what rats usually do. Is that ADHD? I don't know. I keep referring to critical brain development. Why is that? Unlike the rat, the human being in the first 36 months, the brain gains about 80% of its weight during those first 36 months of life. And I'll repeat that again. The brain increases its weight and mass almost 80% in the first 36 months of life. And what's happening? The neurons are multiplying, the synapses are connecting. Very, very important. This is the time from birth to 36 months when neurons are seeking and neural pathways are formed, habits, language, music, interaction, modeling. And the synapses are connecting and all these neural pathways are happening. In addition, most important during these first 36 months is that the synapses, that certain pathways are not being used, they get pruned. They actually, like pruning a branch, pruning limbs. So that's why, for example, that if you take, for example, a Chinese person who grew up in China and they learn English, or if we learn Chinese, never lose that accent during the first, because of what you've experienced during those first few months. So the pruning goes on. So it's not just the synapses forming, but it's eliminating certain things. So this is important because things like language, empathy, maybe attention, all of these things, neural pathways are being formed during this critical brain time of 36 months. And then after that, yes, neurons are happening, there's some neuroplasticity, but nothing compares during this critical brain development phase. It's why when you have geese, there was a physiologist named Lorenz, might sound familiar to you, when the geese were born, there's something called imprinting. So if the geese were first born and there was a human walking next to the goslings, they would follow the human all around the room because the brains were being imprinted. The neurons were firing to follow it. The other thing, as far as proof goes, that's come recently that wasn't available years ago was functional MRI scans. And believe it or not, there are groups now that actually scanning the brain of toddlers. Now, don't ask me how they get a toddler to do this, and it's not harming them, or how you get a toddler to go on a functional MRI, but they do it somehow. And these scans are showing where certain pathways are within the brain. There was a group, particularly out in Cincinnati Children's Hospital, that's done a lot of this work, there's work all around the globe, but Horowitz and others in her group, and Hutton, correlated screen time in children with connections, actual connections through scans in the brain. And what they're finding is that children that had heavier screen time actually showed changes in the neural pathways of their brain as compared to children who did not have heavy screen time. They didn't, and they controlled for finances, economics, parent education, but they took two groups, and the images, if you're interested, are available if you look up, and I think it was even featured in the New York Times article, the Hutton's work, about the changes in the brain shown on scans between toddlers with heavy screen time versus a control group without. His conclusion was there was association between screens compared using the AAP guidelines and actual microstructural integrity of the brain's white matter, supporting language and literacy in pre-kindergarten children. This is not a conclusion, this is not definitive, but it certainly leads to many, many more questions if you can see this on a scan now. We're not just talking about psychological testing. They can actually see it on functional MRI, what's called diffusion gradient. And this work, as I looked into this, actually was going on even before Hutton's group in 2019, 2020. Way back in 2013, they found anatomical correlates to TV viewing. This was a Japanese group. This brain scanning, which is getting better and better each year, is finding that different parts of the brain respond to watching a screen as compared to reading or having a conversation or storytelling. Different parts of the brain. And how does that may have profound effects later on. Besides the imaging, there are now many, many studies showing the effects of screen time on children. Recently as March 2024, findings from this study suggest screen time is associated with a decrease in adult words, back and forth interactions aged between 18 and 36 months after controlling for co-founders. Screen time, another study, screen time less than 1 year old resulted in, they found evidence for communication and problem-solving problems and delays at 2 and 4 years old. Finally, and there's been a pushback against some of this work. There's a lot of naysayers who are saying these studies weren't well controlled, they were biased, you did selection bias of the infants. Here's one that was actually a meta-analysis of 100 studies of 176,000 plus students, found that program viewing was negatively associated with cognitive and psychosocial outcomes in early childhood. What does this mean for later on? As I mentioned before, if you talk to emergency room doctors, public health officials, there appears to be a mental health crisis in our youth. And one of the things I'm proposing is that what happens in these early years is correlated perhaps to what do you do in youth and teenager. Not that it causes it, but the idea, and I'll get into that, is that if it's realized early on in a family that there is a neurotoxic effect in the early years, and I use the analogy of lead poisoning, it may implant a difference in the cultural aspect of that house that screen watching has an effect, a negative effect. It's not a free lunch, which therefore may lead to certain things later on in youth, restricting youth and social media later on. These describe, and everyone familiar with Jonathan Haidt's book, The Anxious Generation? Mostly about social media and the huge amount of teenage depression, suicide ideation. And he makes the case of trying to limit the use of screens later on, which is really, really tough on how to do that. And what I'm making the case is that it's much more practical and doable to do it during those early years. Here's another thing that's often overlooked. Say, well, I have an infant, but I don't let them do it. Well, meanwhile, the mother's holding the toddler and looking with one hand and looking at the screen with the other hand. Okay, going around like this, saying, oh my toddler. But they've shown now that even looking at a screen in the child's presence has an effect. They found parental technology use in the child's presence associated with poor cognition and social behavior among the kids, etc. How does this correlate then? And I think you've been teaching for a while, a long time. Have you noticed also a difference now than, let's say, I don't want to make any assumptions, years ago?
Reading comprehension has plummeted.
Dramatic, not subtle. Would you say it's different now than 2007? I don't want to make any assumptions you were teaching then. But.
Yes, I was. And the kinds of books that I could do with fifth graders are very different. Like there's also the whole Lucy Hawkins things. We can get into all that, but there used to be children's books that were written as if the children were young adults. The vocabulary was really, really rich. And now they have all these ways of creating children's books where the vocabulary difficulty is scrubbed and leveled. And so they're not exposed to the number of words that they used to.
So something has changed.
Well, Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. My fifth graders used to read that on their own. They can't read it on their own.
So, and would you say it's something more than just the COVID experience or economic uncertainty? There's something more that's going on, and this is what Jonathan Haidt makes the
decrease in reading.
Well, the data is supporting just what you say regarding students in reading proficiency and performance by grade level, and then found that American teenagers are stagnant in reading and math. This is back in 2019, despite spending billions to bring up the level of reading. And it's appropriate I'm saying this in the library to love reading. And about a fifth of American 15-year-olds scored so low on this international test that they hadn't even gotten to the 10-year-old level. So something is going on that correlates what you were just talking about. And if what I told you isn't bad enough, I'm just going to slip this in here also, that in Asia in particular, with all the screen use and indoor use, they're having, it's been documented, an epidemic of nearsightedness or myopia. Have you heard about this? Myopia meaning a nearsighted eye. And in fact, it's been correlated to screen time and indoor time not being outdoors, so much that the Chinese government has now started issuing rules and laws about how much time could be spent on screen versus being outdoors. So this is one more thing yet to think about, the myopic epidemic of myopia, or elongation of the eyes leading to other eye disorders later on in adulthood. I'm going to skip to this because you keep hearing, we don't let kids in. And I'm sure there's parents, and I mentioned this earlier, in Silicon Valley, the most popular school, does anyone take a guess? This is in Sunnyvale, the heart of Silicon Valley and technology, what the most popular school is. These are the tech engineers, the CEOs, it's Waldorf. It has the highest weight, because there was an article about this in late 2000 something, 2008, 2009, I think. The tech industry itself does not want their kids on screens. What does that tell you? In fact, they have what's called no screen nanny contracts in Silicon Valley, where if they hire a nanny to watch their 2-year-olds, part of the contract is they will not use a screen and they don't want their 2-year-old on a screen. So that's 2, 3%, 5% of an enlightened population, but that's hardly good enough. It can't be just the elites, the highly educated, that are understanding the issues here. Jonathan Haidt in a recent interview said, I don't know where he got the data from, he predicts that 40% of 2-year-olds have their own iPads, And you see this at airports and things, and it can be discouraging. However, the pushback, and one of the major ones you'll hear, Andrew Bilski, he is a PhD psychologist at Oxford, has argued that there is not enough data to say that this technology is causing any real problems, that the studies weren't done right, that they didn't have proper controls, et cetera. What I did some months ago is I went online to, here you go, ChatGPT, and I just tried to check what percentage of neurobiologists from scholarly articles felt that there were toxic effects from screen use in infancy and early childhood. And it came back something like 83% of people who research this feel there is a causation, not just correlate, that there is an effect here, that it's not just an artifact of the study, but there has been some pushback. So I don't want to suggest that you're not going to hear, particularly scientists that are funded by the tech companies, and you're going to get pushback from the tech companies for sure. Which leads me to this next concept of Pascal's wager. Remember that from high school or philosophy, who Pascal was? Blaise Pascal, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, made a famous wager way back then about the belief in God. And he was a philosopher, French philosopher. And when asked, and they said, well, there is no evidence of this. Why are you, and Pascal, you even talked against this. And his reply was that if he didn't believe in God, he risked having eternal hell and hellfire and brimstone. So whether he believed it or not, it was better if he didn't know the answer to go ahead and believe in God, because that was the better choice. Because the consequences of not knowing were so horrible that you might as well go ahead and believe, which is kind of a cynical way of really questions the ethics of that. But that's the famous Pascal's wager. When you have something unknown, you take something that has the least consequences or the better consequences, even though you're not sure of the answer. Some of that can be applied to this question too. If it's unresolved about this screen effects on the developing brain, it makes all the sense in the world to assume that it's neurotoxic and say, no, it's benign, especially when we have all this evidence of social mood disorders in teenagers, et cetera, attention deficit, et cetera. A little bit on the ethics. Where does the infant themselves stand in all this? If you have a mother that dismisses all of this or just says, I get home, I'm so tired, I've been working all day, I'm just being hassled, I gotta have a break. Here's your iPad, Johnny, leave me alone. Does Johnny, 2-year-old Johnny, have any rights? Even though they don't have any autonomy, they don't have agency, they can't make judgments. And I would argue that they do have rights. And this is called bodily integrity, as promoted by a philosopher named Earl. And bodily integrity, Earp rather, is when a person is not able to consent to have something done, but might have consented if they were aware or they could attain autonomy. And I'm saying that an infant, even though it isn't aware of what's going on, has no choice in the matter. If you say, we're going to let you have this tablet, but you know there's a 40% you're going to have attention deficit or have poor social relations or depression, you're not going to tell that, the infant's not going to say, no, no, I don't want it. Does that infant have rights to their future? So I refer to that as brain integrity rights. And this was initially brought up with things with tattoos about bodily integrity rights. Do parents have a right to tattoo an infant at birth or do an ear piercing? Or it's even been applied to things like circumcision as well. Bodily integrity rights, when the infant has no say, does that infant have any rights about their future? And speaking of which, I also want to make clear when it comes up parental arguments, so far as I know, there's no hard evidence that using screens and so-called educational interactive programs has any mental enhancement, any hard evidence, not claims by the companies, hard evidence that their cognitive capacity is increased. There was something years ago called Baby Einstein and variations of Baby Einstein, but none of it has held up to peer-reviewed objective analysis that shows giving a screen to a toddler less than 3-year-old gives them higher cognitive abilities. Not that, doesn't mean that they can't be brilliant later on, but as far as that goes. And I mentioned this about rights we already kind of talked about that. What else do screens do besides affecting the neural pathways? Well, the other things is what it keeps the toddler from doing, what they're not doing. And one of the things that psychologists and child psychologists, what's so crucial during these years, rather than being on a screen, is interaction, unsupervised play. Like I showed you the picture of the bonobo chimpanzee when they're pulling around and they're testing. You've seen these wildlife pictures when the chimpanzee or the bonobos are testing each other, playing, running. All that's happening and their brain is learning stuff on how to relate, how to do give and take, how to read someone's expression. Are they angry? Are they sad? All that's happening during those first 3 years. So what you want, the argument is that unsupervised play is the natural state of the primate, not the childhood being taken over by a screen where there isn't this interaction, where there isn't this thing where you have to judge cooperation, judge how far you can go, judge the emotions of the person next to you. And Stephen Horowitz has written about this, and he really emphasizes that it is this playtime, free play, not supervised, no screens, is so critical to society of how we get along, what happens during those early childhood years, that it isn't all about you, that it isn't all about your self-interest, it isn't about immediate gratification. So here is the refrain. When you mention this, I hear this a lot from grandparents who have grandkids, and they bring up when the grandkids come over and all the kids are on the screen, like, oh, some of them actually have baskets where they want the kids to put their smartphones when they come to the house. The mother might say, I know it's bad. I understand it's not helpful watching this stuff, whatever it is. My life is just too busy. And besides, how is it any different than French lessons or violin lessons or playing chess? Well, it is different. And this has been brought up, I bring this up by this well-known poet about Mother's Little Helper, getting her through the day, but it was a little different thing back in 1967. It wasn't a screen or a tablet. It was Sir Michael Jagger talking about the Mother's Little Helper being a Valium pill. Has the iPad become the new Mother's Little Helper to replace the Valium of Mick Jagger? The next question is, well, so what? It's not my problem. Okay, so the kids can't concentrate, the kids aren't deep reading. We seem to be getting along. Besides, AI is going to be coming along anyway. A lot of complicated cognitive tasks are going to be performed by AI. Who cares if they aren't reading Shakespeare? And I think we should care. There is a self-interest. You should not proselytize or preach to you, but there's a self-interest to this aspect. And this goes all the way back to even Thomas Jefferson, where he talked about an educated citizenry as a part of a democracy. And by educated, I don't mean necessarily how many degrees you have on the wall, but the ability to deep read, to think critically, to read something more than 140 characters, something with multiple pages. And they were very, and you know, they had their faults, but they were very much subject to the idea that they wanted their citizens to be well-read, not necessarily have degrees, but being able to have the democracy work, to make reasonable choices. So I get to this segment now. Years ago, I was watching a movie in the 1980s. It wasn't a great movie. It had to be called RoboCop. Now, why do I mention this? In RoboCop, it's a dystopia. It's just chaos and the robot. But during RoboCop, they had what we would call reality TV. I think it was made in 1986 or 1987, way before reality TV. And they were just doing idiotic things throughout the movie. And I said, this director, there's a subtext to what this director is getting at. And it's just chaos. And then I got it, because they kept saying during the movie on the thing, I'll buy that for $0.25. I said, I've heard that phrase, I'll buy that. They dumped some water on somebody, I'll buy it. And it comes from, I remember there was a story written, a science fiction story in the 1950s, 1951, I think, called The Marching Morons. Does anyone science fiction stands there? And it was a dystopia where most of the world did not read, and there was just a 3 or 5% elite group, and they had a problem with overpopulation, let's say. And they had to bring back, well, I won't get into it, they had to bring back a real estate swindler to try to help solve their problem. But the thing is, if we have a society where deep reading isn't occurring, is there a consequence? And I can say that nicely here being in the library. And we were over recently, and happened to be in Africa, and it was sad to hear that in certain villages they had constructed libraries, and each year the libraries are getting used less and less and less. In fact, I would even say that not just in Africa, but all throughout the world, you know, we had a bipedal posture, I guess, through evolution. It seems that the new posture now is almost, I don't know what you would call this, tripedal, when people are walking around the airports, holding this in hand. This is the new, it seems that humans, this is the way it is now. I mean, take a look at that. How many people are walking around holding this in front of them, that it's part of their body, it's part of it. So what are we heading for with that? Or alternatively, this gentleman, whose name was John Locke, way back in the 1600s, John Locke, I think, was possibly the first child psychologist. He was the first one to note, and it seems so obvious to us now, that what happens during childhood affects what that adult human will be. It seems obvious now with Freud and psychology, but it was, at the time, it was a very strange idea, because people thought the humans were just as they were. It wasn't correlated to their early childhood experiences. And he was the one that also talked about a child's brain being tabula rasa, a blank slate, that what happened to them during their early childhood was imprinted later on. Again, pretty ahead of his time. And one of the quotes was, that which parents should take care of is to distinguish between the wants of fancy and those of nature. So we get back to this ethical question. What role should childcare providers, teachers play in controlling this? If parents say, no, I just couldn't, I need these iPads because I can't handle my life, my kids love it, all the other kids have them. Oh, I should say, we're talking about toddlers, not kindergarten. And there's really no problem. Should the providers nudge that parent to get their toddler off the screen during this critical brain development? And I say, unlike the pediatric policy, yes, there should be stronger nudging and actually prohibit all of it.
What about telling the parents to get off the screens?
Sorry?
What about telling the parents to get off the screens first?
That is a very good goal. Very, very tough to unwind that. Even tougher, I would say, than I mentioned the smoking era of when 30–40% of the population.
It gives you that
dopamine loop.
Reward every time you're looking at
very, very tough.
So
and that's a
you can't take it away from them because
they have to have it.
It's like cocaine or whatever.
So what's your name? Sorry.
Margo.
Excellent point. And the way I approach that is that does the parent, I won't get into free will and all that stuff, but let's say even more simple. If somehow we could make parents aware of the potential neurotoxicity, I want to believe that the maternal instinct for that infant in the arms may compete with the dopamine rush of having that. It won't be 100%, but even if it's 20–30% of parents saying, oh my gosh, it's like, would you want to bring up an infant that has lead in the pipes? You would probably say, I got to change the pipes. So there's a chance that competing interest of having that infant, that maternal instinct to protect that infant beyond just welfare rights, the love, competing with the dopamine may play a role, but it's a very, very hard nut to crack. Because unlike cigarette smoking, the technology is part of our lives. It's like electricity or fire or water. We use it for, it isn't just pleasure or entertainment. We use it for everything. And I'm going to propose this, but to me, given that we use it for everything, it doesn't seem impossible to just have no screens for the first 3 years of life. I know it for toddlers. It just seems to be that is not such an unreasonable burden to happen. And maybe it is. Maybe I'm being naive. On reading, I think what I'm getting at is that reading isn't just an elite thing or the magic of having a paper book, like looking at it in a museum or an antique film. There is, from some of the brief coverage I've done of the evidence, something is different happening in the brain when you're reading or hearing a story as opposed to interacting with the screen. Call it passive entertainment versus active. It's a difference to me between when you have a track running around the mile track versus being placed in a Ferrari and going around the track. The Ferrari will get you there much faster. What do you lose by that Ferrari carrying you around the track? Something that the brain needs. And I don't think that we're still primates. We are not silicon carbon connected yet. We're still primates and still have the needs to interact, empathize.
What do you mean by yet?
Well, there is the so-called singularity when they're talking about there may be some time in the future when we may be some hybrid. I don't want to get into science fiction, but or we may even be, actually even now, we're sort of as a hybrid with silicone, given when you calculate how much time people have one of these in their hands at an airport, I think we're already partly there. It may not be implanted in the brain like an implant, but it's certainly, the interaction is there.
We could not adequately interact with the world without it.
Or you must, well, you actually probably could, but the problem comes up is, as authors like Sherry Turkle have written about, is that when it comes to normal interaction, when you go to a restaurant at a table and you see couples each staring at their screen, I don't know if they're dating, whatever it is, or sitting at a table and all the kids have their own iPad in the restaurant looking at it, knowing, I think that there's a price to pay in our, not that I think, social interaction, empathy, attention. Okay.
But I think there was a study where they had kids, teenagers come, where they came together for a meal and they had to put their phones down.
Right.
For 20 minutes.
Yes.
They were all wrecked.
They went into withdrawal.
No,
You got,
they were, again, it's addiction.
yeah, and there was a documentary on just that topic that showed that if the girl could go a night without it and they put it in a jar or something, they couldn't because the
It's not
dopamine.
just teenagers.
Yeah, yes,
It's
very, very tough.
just
But
as-
again, I get back to the beneficence, the principle of beneficence. Do we want to do harm to that developing brain? And I may be naive, but I think that particularly, I keep saying maternal, I don't want to just say that the fathers don't care, but that is a strong instinct to protect that. And perhaps if there was more knowledge about what's actually going on, that may supersede the selfish interest of the having thing. So other things about here, I'm slowly getting into reading here. There's a correlation with what happens in early childhood and reading. And John Adams famously said that when he talks about reading and voting, how can I judge? How can any man judge unless his mind has been opened and enlarged by reading? And here, supporting perhaps mentioned earlier, the data for kids reading does not look good. The data is alarming. Fewer children today identify as frequent readers, and reading frequency is plummeting. 15%, only 15% of 15 to 17-year-olds enjoy reading. Again, is this just an elitist activity? Like enjoy painting or enjoy, what would be an analogy?
Playing musical instruments.
Playing musical. The reading in our brains plays as much, and deep thinking, as much role as exercise for our muscles. There is something different that happens with our brain that is unlike anything else. Aldous Huxley famously said, he wasn't talking about screens, people will come to love their oppression, to adore the technologies that undo their capacities to think. 1931, great author of Brave New World. For references, I recommend not only Jonathan Haidt, but Jean Twenge wrote about the iGen generation, about what's happening with our teenagers and problems of mood disorders, mental health issues. And of course, we have our own local reader, a fellow comes from our town, Charlotte's Web fame. E.B. White, famous, reading is the work of the alert mind, demanding under ideal conditions, produces a sort of ecstasy. How can they, we got to give the kids a chance to experience that ecstasy. Got back to the original policy statement. I don't think this is strong enough. I think this is highly idealistic. To me, it has to be all or nothing. You have to say zero. And there's a practical reason. It's so hard if you give a kid half hour, say, nope, time's up. You only get a half hour, or I'm going to decide the shows that you can watch, even to a 2 or 3 year old. Really, really tough. And I believe for most households, not all, that's really can't be happening. So when I'm promoting the idea, and I welcome your comments, I'm using this thing, screen-free birth to 3, but I welcome any other slogans you have. The idea being is that if we can get to a point where there's no screens at all for that critical brain development, I'm not talking about doing away with technology. You can just use
that in school.
Because saying we're going to watch it with you, or you can only watch 15 minutes, we all know that is BS. It just is not going to be happening, except in a very small percent of the well-educated population that's going to be actually doing that is monitoring this. And we do see it on airplanes and things when parents are reading to kids and not on tablets, but they seem to be the exception by far, okay? And in closing, here's my message to the toddler. appropriate in this beautiful library. Fall in love with reading, be curious and kind, act decently, and question everything, including this talk. I thank you. Please, if you disagree, welcome anyone to push back against any of this. It's always tough preaching to the choir. I want to know someone who sees someone says, it's not so bad. My nephew was a digital native, had an iPad in the crib, and now is a head of an English department somewhere. Yeah.
Yeah, not pushback, but just some thoughts and a question. Your comparisons to TV made me think of the phenomenon of latchkey kids, and
Right.
My impression is that there are parents who rely on screens to occupy their infants while they're working,
Right.
while they're taking classes,
Yep.
taking care of the household. So among the researchers who have identified this and are behind the narrative that there's a neurotoxic effect, is there anyone advocating for social welfare for these families that would alleviate the root causes of why they're relying on the screens in the first place?
That's very astute of you. That was one section of my dissertation, actually, about the ethics. What about the poor working mother who has no alternative, who can't stay at home and read? And it's unfair that they can't have a no screen contract nanny, right? They're working, or they're so exhausted they can't interact and use big words at table, or the vocabulary is limited anyway. And one of the things I brought up is that if we had child centers, care that would have perhaps no screen policy, with professional or well-trained staff to interact with the kids, duplicating the Waldorf school.
As a childcare worker, and they're professionals, not currently, but professional, yes.
Yeah, I'm sorry, you're a childcare worker?
I was a childcare worker for about 10 years, yeah.
Do you think that that's doable, that you could have I'm using the Waldorf model here.
Well, when I was with kids, we never had a screen, but I'm old, so it was probably free screens everywhere. Yeah.
Unfortunately, I need to scoot. I have family in town and I'm gotta get dinner on the table. Thank you.
Betsy, thanks for coming.
I can answer the question that you asked.
Yes.
But I do think it's possible. Personally, of course, I have one grandchild, and he's 2 years and 4 months old, and he's never seen a screen. And he, in September, earliest, go to Waldorf school is in September, and he's going to Waldorf Summer, where he will have no screens at school until he's 10. Kate and John, his parents are, and my daughter and son-in-law are talking about whether he will have any screens at home or when he will have screens. And I spent a lot of time when he reads stories to me, obviously looking at pictures from reading, but he knows the books so well. It's extraordinary, his vibrance, and he's being raised in a better way than my children were raised.
Yeah, and if he can go screen-free until age 10, that's remarkable.
Yeah, I don't know if that will be it, and I think that Kate feels like, oh boy, what am I doing? And I have to take responsibility. I have to think about this a lot. He has one friend who has exactly the same life and policies, and could not get into the Waldorf school, which is a sad thing for everybody involved.
And even at the Waldorf model, I think some of the Waldorfs, they may have no tech at school, they come home to as much tech as they want. And some of the, I'm not aware of all the 100 or so Waldorf schools that there are, whether that's the case, but there's a lot of pressure. And I'm not even saying that screens are all bad. I mean, they really aren't. They're fantastic. I use it all. It's the best library ever invented, ever, in the history of anything.
Does the school at 10 then have screens in the Waldorf school?
Excuse me?
Does that, when he turns 10, at the
Well,
Waldorf,
I don't
then they have screens?
I don't know.
I think it's the opposite, fifth grade.
To carry on another,
That might be it.
since we're doing anecdotes, I know a music teacher who can, when they first get their students, she can tell when they're interviewing immediately if they're high screen users or not at age 5, 6, 7, immediately, or if they're Waldorf. Like that, they can tell the difference between the interaction, the attention, looking in the eye. It's very, very apparent. It would be wonderful if there was a national mandate to use not all aspects, but to learn from some of the Waldorf things, although Waldorf is not perfect.
Exactly.
And again, I'm not advocating no technology, no screens. I'm very specific, my proposal is for this critical brain development. If we could only do that, and I also think that if that was like lead toxicity, part of the home culture, that there would be a carry-through later on that say, gee, maybe it isn't benign or helpful enhancing. Maybe we don't want him to be, or when they're older, to be on social media so much or limited or whatever it is. And maybe you'll seep down, but I don't know, I may be naive about this.
That child though, Lucian will, if I have a picture on my phone, and it's an immediate attention grabber of focus. And I have shown him a picture and then realized, wondered what we're feeling about that. So we have a completely accepting group of people.
Yeah.
Nobody thinks he should be doing that. And I don't have any sense of how you could ever implement what you're talking about.
Screen-free.
Exactly right.
The reason I limit it to 3 years, it seems to be doable. For 36 months, just to keep that's not unreasonable. And then say, okay, whatever happens,
I
we'll do
just
it.
mean in this political climate, there's so many things that say exactly the same thing. Really? It's really, really challenging.
Well, somebody has
Yeah.
to start the movement.
Yeah, yes, yeah, oh,
Oh,
Yeah.
listen, thank you for an excellent talk, I enjoyed it, thank you, much. I'm a psychologist,
Yeah.
so this
Great.
is familiar to me. But, one of the things that must complicate this scenario is that if you, in most families, there's more than one child may be under 36 months, and another child may be 5 or 6. And so what's a parent to do, or a babysitter, where you have these ones want to watch,
right.
and this one can't? How do you manage that? I don't know.
I don't know. Something, maybe just, I don't know, maybe if just the idea is implanted within the family that this is not a free lunch for those critical brain period, that there's a price to pay, and that we're seeing
They don't
now.
want to watch TV and they're exhausted. They don't, they too have changing.
Yeah.
We all are. When Lucian is there, we don't, of course, ever watch any TV. They do something else in his
Well,
body.
to be devil's advocate, and this is something slightly separate. I moved my family to England and raised them there because I felt the level of reading was better, and indeed, that worked. However, I'm one of a big family, and we all became psychologists and PhDs and journalists and everything. And every day after school in the 50s and 60s, we'd come home and we'd watch the Three Stooges, that kind of thing, for about an hour. And then we had so much homework, and we had very hard schools. So we came home, we were wound up. We had an hour unsupervised. My parents were someplace else. Your job, that was not harmful per se, but it was just, oh God, our minds could just relax. And then we went and did our homework. And I always thought it was paradoxical that everybody went off and did so well academically after that, because we had this sandwich effect of the no-brainer 1960s.
Right.
Oh, it's just
an hour, and also it's usually a group activity.
I guess what I'm saying, I guess my concern is that there is a place where for kids, particularly if they go to hard schools and they come home,
Right.
they need to be able to relax in a way that is unpressured, and at the same time that the kids aren't going to squabble with each other.
Yeah,
So there has to be, whether it's listening to music or doing some activity that is funny,
Right.
fun,
Entertaining.
amusing, no-brainers for an hour.
Hopefully,
And creating that,
to de-stress when they.
and creating that is the real.
Shouldn't have to de-stress.
Well, but if you live in New York City, you're gonna come home, you've been on the bus or the subway, and there's a natural, sure, if you're in Maine, maybe not so much, but, so needs to be a place and a way.
and we've always had, right, you're right, we've always had TV, and then in the 30s, like people like Bertrand Russell was complaining about radio being overstimulated. So, but I think this issue.
This is different.
This is an entirely, I always say, yeah, it's different this time,
This is extrapolating what you're saying.
where they're in a completely different world, and
Completely different, but
which,
it's regression in the service of the ego for this. Freud talks about how it's actually helpful and healthy to have a way of dumbing down, of regressing, of doing something that is.
And that's, and you know, but would you say, I never, a 3-year-old probably doesn't need to
No, this is
de-stress.
separate.
Correct, yeah, gotcha.
No, this is, you're talking about development, and
Yeah,
I'm talking
3
about
years.
something else.
And what you've observed, if you hang out with somebody who's less than 3, is intuitive. Brain revolutions are happening every minute.
Yeah.
I find my grandson, it's odd to say, as currently the most interesting person I know. I feel it. He is just.
They're a learning machine.
Yeah. And every time I see him, he's completely different and better and bigger. So revolutions are happening. Everybody can know this. Every parent who remembers what their baby was like knows this.
Knows that this is toxic.
Yes.
Intuitively knows it, but there's denial. Is that what you're saying? Or
I
the
think
the
so.
dopamine's too
Yeah,
strong?
and through the need that we're discussing. I mean, they've got a great life. They're struggling tremendously to do the jobs, to do this, but they're well off, you know, they have,
Yeah.
you know, some people don't.
Yeah,
And what happens to those people are those single parents who come home and they have.
it's tough.
Really
It's a tough.
All the other kids have it, so.
But even if there's only a 10, 20% capture rate, where this catches on, the idea of up to age 3, 20% capture rate, 30%, we're not going to do a massive conversion. That's something in itself that this is what Jonathan Haidt is trying to do with teenagers, trying to do a few little micro steps, like no smartphones at school, no bringing the screens to the bedroom, just little things if you've read his book. And Haidt, H-A-I-D-T, The Anxious Generation's been a massive publicity and bestseller.
You could start in the doctor's waiting room. You could start in the doctor's waiting room with your slogan and your.
Oh, that's so good.
With your information.
Well, that's the nutrition.
That's what I mean, yeah, pediatrician.
So, yeah, and then just to change the culture a little bit, that there could be a problem, because I think that the reward for denial is just so strong. I mean, again, I'm talking about a specific period of time, not no technology or no, that's absurd. That's as absurd as saying no electricity, and that's not what I'm arguing. Any other counter?
Cross-cultural, oh, sorry, you go ahead.
Yes, I say, I'm sort of a chronic, butt person, but I haven't been able to come up with any very good.
Please, I want
Well,
to.
the one I've come up with is just this, I mean, sort of like at 60,000 feet, and having like sort of majored in anthropology in school a long time ago, I mean, people are tool makers. We make technologies, and I'm not just talking about men's tools, but all kinds of tools, including books and so forth. And a lot of them have real advantages. A lot of them have terrible side effects. But the one thing I'm trying to hang my mind is, here we go. I get most of my stories from public radio, but anyway, it was a story essentially about an ethnobotanist. Supposedly, he was in some Central American country and trying to learn about the various herbs and so forth that it happened, mostly women knew a lot about. And he had his little notepad and everything there. He was following around. He had sort of a translator, he sort of knew the language. And so he was writing everything down and that they would tell him. And the women were laughing at him because they just wondered why he just couldn't remember. I mean, so I kind of wonder if, you know, there's always positive gains, and they're probably wonderful things. I'm big on books and all that. I used to be more so for Netflix, but anyway. But you know, all these kind of technological changes have their pluses and minuses.
Yes. And it's not going away,
Well,
that's for sure.
really brought in the book thing, but what was lost when that technology was taken on of reading and so forth, in terms as opposed to sort of an oral culture where.
You're talking about what people used to be able to say ethics for hours.
Right, exactly, same thing, exactly.
A very few.
Well, the point is that we're seeing the consequences of this now, and I guess in psychology, you probably if you do clinical practice, the explosion of mood disorders
Right, I'm
and several.
retired, but I read about it, yeah.
So there are consequences in addition to cognitive. So, but again, I'm not making the point. It's absurd. It would be absurd to do away with technology or the internet or anything like that at all. Just this very specific time may help. It may not, but help mitigate later on.
And you're really working at spreading the word. No, I mean, really, you have to.
Yeah.
We all have to. And I believe it, and I try to gently tell people that that I'm teaching myself, who have children who are at home, and I say, Lucian, Lucian doesn't, they know about Lucian, I've seen him on my lap a few times, and he doesn't do screens, and really try to help them think about that.
Yeah.
And we do, I mean.
Or use them selectively, or yeah. Yeah.
And it's our world.
Yeah.
It's Lucian's world,
Yeah.
And it's getting worse. Actively, rapidly.
Yeah.
Getting worse.
Yeah. Or yeah. Consequences. Well, anything else?
I would thought I had is that,
Yeah.
is that a lot of what I'm talking about is the poor parent or the tired parent that resorts to technology and so they can go to work because they stress out or whatever. But the other thing I've seen a little bit of is that it's fairly natural that, kids do the darndest things. It's like for a small child to do something that's adult is like a real neat thing.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And so like, when a kid picks up a phone, you can actually like talk to the thing. And it's like, wow.
Yeah.
Amazing. So it's not just that the poor parent is too stressed out. It's also that I think
they have a term for that.
Their child doing an adult thing
Right.
is.
With the screens, they talk, this again, very specific from birth to age 3, not youth, not birth, technoference. They've actually coined a term of the toddler being interfered with their interaction because the parent is on this thing or mimicking, and it's called technoference.
Yeah, I'm not saying that, I'm just saying that the motives for this are kind of complicated, and it obviously takes a lot to lead people to what seems to be a better way.
Thank you. I think we can. Thanks.